Spanish. Sloan, my freshman this year, she's been doing Duolingo. Like she does like a 10-minute thing online every day. She's doing her own since 8th grade. And so she like can speak a lot of Spanish and understands the language. And I didn't learn that for 4 years of Spanish. Not a single thing.
I had for 1 and 2, and then I had Jake for 3. And she was like, I was like, man, you're out the back.
I need to be in remedial Spanish.
Yeah. How much hang on? Hang on, that's all I got. Everyone's in Mexico.
Bellefontaine City Council is now in session. Please rise for the invocation led by Councilman Ayler, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
Dear Heavenly Father, as we conduct our city's business this evening, we ask that you are with us. Special request to look after our first responders, our policemen, and our firemen. We ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Just a reminder to the folks in the audience, pursuant to Bellefontaine City Council safety rules, there should be no headgear worn by any person in the audience that includes all hats. That's you, sir. Take off your hat.
If you got a right to gun, carry a gun anywhere, I got a right to wear a hat.
Chief.
Yeah, you're gonna have to leave if you don't take your hat off, sir.
Where's the rule? I can't wear a hat.
It's the city council.
That is a violation of the First Amendment.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it is.
Chief, we have this individual removed.
Yeah, come on, sir. We gotta go.
All right.
Thank you.
Take your hat off. Welcome back. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mrs. Baker. Mr. Davis.
Here.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick. Here. Mrs. James.
Here.
Mr. Reeser.
Here.
Mr. Springs.
Here.
Mr. Ayler.
Here.
Mr. Springs,
Make a motion that we approve the absence of Councilwoman Baker.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Make a motion that we suspend the reading of the minutes.
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Christmas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council and guests. Tonight I have one thing. We have a vacancy, a term expiring on the Board of Zoning Appeals. It's Michael Vettorino. He has also agreed to extend and go on for another term, which is a 5-year term. I'd like to make that appointment.
A motion and a second to appoint Mike Vettorino for a 5-year term to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Motion made by Mr. Ayler, seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
And that is my report.
Thank you, Mayor. Any questions or comments for the mayor? Seeing none, we'll move to Service Safety Director, Mr. Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council. Good evening, guests. It's nice to see you all. Feels like a long time since I've sat across the table from you. I guess it has been since the beginning of December. So I'm glad to be back. Thank you for the thoughtful gift and outfit for our new son. So apologize for my absence, but it was nice to be away and spend some time with them. But good to be back in the swing of things. Don't really have much to report. I've only been back in the office for a couple of days. I do just want to give a public thanks to our water department and show our appreciation to them. Those guys have been working their tails off the last couple of weeks. I think they've had upwards of 8 different water main breaks during this cold snap, and a couple of them have been pretty tedious for them. But they've done a really good job and kept the service interruptions as minimal as possible. Unfortunately, when we get these sub-zero temperatures, this happens, and it's just, as you can imagine, a miserable time of year to be waist deep in water and a hole in the ground. So those guys do a great job, and just want to publicly express my appreciation to them. That I'll end my report.
Thank you, Mr. Dodds. Any questions or comments from Mr. Dodds? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stoddard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council and guests. I'd just like to bring your attention, council, to legislative item 2502. It regards compensation and for the municipal court prosecutor secretary and the victim's advocate position. That position is not changing. Historically, it has been grant funded for a percentage of hours basically that are covered by that position. And when that legislation was initially put in place, I think all the way back in 2015, one of the first years we received that grant, the split was a little different between the city and the county. Now the way we do it is the city pays for the position, and then the county once a month reimburses for their 40% share of that expense. And then in addition to that, we receive a grant. So that grant will then also be shared, and it'll just basically be a math computation through Fred's office to basically reduce the overall cost of that position. So we just have to amend that authorizing ordinance to not conflict with the grant recipient funds and the position. So the council had already previously approved the pay rates for that position, so that's not changing. So sorry for that long explanation, but this will be the last time we see that moving forward. So that's all for my report.
Thank you, Mr. Solly. Any comments or questions for Mr. Solly? Seeing none, we'll move to auditor's report. Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Any questions or comments for Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, we'll move to Police Chief Marlin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Evening, Council. Just a couple vehicle updates is all. Our public safety was able to push our K9 unit to the front, and inside of a week, they had it ready to go to our garage, and our garage guys turned it over in about a day and a half. So they were able to do that fairly seamlessly, so our dog was actually only down for a few hours, so the new K9 unit is now on the road. While picking up the K9 unit, we dropped off our pickup truck for upfitting. However, they let us know that it would be 8 to 10 weeks before that would be in the process. So it'll still be a minute before we see our pickup truck. And then they'll schedule the police utility vehicle, the SUV, for after that. The K9 unit represents the last of the cars from 2023. That's how long we waited on that one. And then the other two are from 2024, just so you know. That is my report. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Any questions for the chief? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Fire Department, Chief Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, everybody. Not a whole lot, just want to make council aware that our school car, the Honda Accord that we use, they just use that to travel back and forth to Columbus or Lima, wherever they're going to school. Took a hit, we're guessing somewhere in a parking lot got backed into, so only $1,500 of damage to the right front fender, so we're getting that fixed. It's still drivable, so it's not going to be a big, huge loss. We may just be without it for a couple weeks while it's getting fixed. Other than that, I just want to continue to publicly thank my guys and gal downstairs. As I spoke last time, we still have a lot of guys that are in medical school, EMT school, so they continue to do a good job picking up the slack and filling in where needed with no complaints. So I just like to thank them again. That's all I got.
Thank you, Chief. Any questions or comments for the chief? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Engineer's Office, Mr. Bischoff.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple things, I guess, to keep you informed. Just kind of running through some of last year's numbers, looking at kind of the 3-year trend on our permitting and our new builds. Last year, we had 37 new homes built. So far this week, we've already issued 8 new permits for new builds. I think we're up to about 12 or 15 for the month so far, just in January, compared to 37 of all last year. Permits issued 2024 for zoning, street opening, curb sidewalk. We issued 484 permits, which averages about 2 per workday coming through our office. 2023, we were at 252. And then back in 2022, we were at 217. So things continue to pick up and be busy. So that's a good thing. So that's all I have in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Bischoff. Any questions or comments from Mr. Bischoff? Seeing none, we'll move to Economic Development from Mr. Ballrath.
Thank you, Mr. President, Community Council Administration. Was fortunate to go with Mayor Chrisman and Commissioner Fitzpatrick to a rural Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission event last week, hosted down in Jerome Township. It was interesting, just shared a few points of growth that are happening across the region, thought you might find interesting. Mr. Bischoff shared some of our new home permits. Village of Plain City has had 500 new home permits in the past 18 months. Pretty significant growth they're expecting there. And Marysville, they didn't share a home permit, but they did say that the New Albany company, which is responsible for much of the planned growth that's happened in New Albany, has purchased 1,200 acres in Marysville. They're calling it Marysville East and Marysville South. So for future growth within the city. So yeah, it's not a, hey, we're competing. It's just showing that there's progress that's still moving out this direction and a lot of activity going on. Marysville also shared they have a $100 million redevelopment project on 17 acres in their downtown that they're working on, kind of the old grain silos and water treatment plant that they had. It was a good interacting time, just hearing some best practices and pieces that are happening in other communities. So fortunate city and county both have ties and Morpsey and membership there. I think there's a lot of value that we received from that. Also had last week, Clark State College hosted a workforce summit up at Ohio High Point. We had probably 45, 50 folks that were able to attend that. Nice panel with Transportation Research Center, our local hospital, Power Built, and Honda. Just talking about the workforce and challenges that we face. Probably the biggest thing that they all shared was it's still just not enough people. That was kind of the common thread. They need more people. Some of it was just, hey, we need the basic laborers, and others it was, hey, we need a lot more of the high-end professional. So it's kind of across the board, there's needs there. Thankfully, they're being able to fill their positions, but it's still, hey, we see the challenge of recruiting and bringing people out to a community like ours. Last thing I'll share, Maddie from our downtown Bellefontaine partnership, she wasn't able to make it tonight, so just wanted me to pass along that 2 upcoming events. Next Friday, the 7th, is the chocolate walk. No street closures for that, but tickets are available. It's a $25 event, and you get to have all sorts of chocolates as you walk around town. And then the following Thursday, the 13th, is Thursday the 13th, a Galentine's night out. I believe she said that the alleyway between High Point Graphics and the old pharmacy building will be closed as they're putting a little food truck there. But that's a free event. It's doing a little shop hop, so I want to pass those along from her side. That's all I had.
Thank you, Mr. Ballrath. Any comments or questions for Mr. Ballrath? Thank you, sir. That concludes the report for the administration. We'll now move to the reports of standing committees. Finance Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have one ordinance tonight, and it is 2502, which Law Director Stahle very eloquently explained earlier, so I'm not going to do it again. We are going to ask for first and final on that so that we can get that one cleared up and her pay will suffer. So that concludes my report for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Springs. Rules Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Committee met in council chambers on January 23rd at 11 a.m. Just a reminder, this was a meeting that was open to the public. Notice was given at the last council meeting, and it was given to the media ahead of time as required. The committee at that time voted 3-0 in favor of proceeding with another vote on the same solar legislation that has been previously presented from Planning Commission. However, with a missing council member tonight, we're going to be moving to table that ordinance tonight. The committee also voted 3-0 to put forth the extension or the making permanent of the moratorium on dispensaries and cultivators within the city limits. The current one-year moratorium actually expires on February 13th, but we're going to be moving to table that ordinance tonight as well until we have a full council to vote. Lastly, at the meeting, the committee discussed the potential for legalizing street use of golf carts. There wasn't much opposition to that, but there's a lot of details to iron out still, so we'll be meeting again soon to discuss that before legislation comes forward. And that ends my report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. The chair will recognize you when those ordinances come up for reading for purposes of making your motions to table.
Okay.
Safety Committee, Mr. Reason.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Utilities Committee, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have no items on the agenda this evening. However, I will be working to schedule a committee meeting to discuss the previously tabled ordinances on tap fees. So once I get that scheduled, I will send out the appropriate notices.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Streets Committee, Mr. Ayler.
Good evening. We have two ordinances on the agenda tonight. One for first reading, 2505, and one for second reading, 2501.
Thank you, Mr. Ayler. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Thank you, Mrs. Fitzpatrick. Audit Committee, in Mrs. Baker's absence, Mr. Ayler. Do you have any report from the Audit Committee? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ayler. That concludes the reports from standing committees. We now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. If there are any citizens who seek to address council, please approach the lectern, state your name and address, after which the chair will recognize you to speak for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of council and administration, Howard Trawl, 1324 Omaha Road. I heard Ms. James indicate that the ordinance on the marijuana dispensaries was tabled, but having come down here anyway, want to give you a little talk on it. You know, I've been here before and talked about it, but I am here on behalf of the urging of judges, some ministers in town, and the children and young adults of Logan County and Bellefontaine. I hope that you will, when it comes on the floor, pass a permanent moratorium on marijuana sales. We all know that there's tons of evidence out there that marijuana is a gateway drug to other drugs. No less a public figure than Elton John in the last several weeks in the public media indicated that as a reformed drug addict, he got his start with marijuana, and he believes it's the biggest mistake that's been made for many, many years in having Canada, the United States, approve recreational marijuana. Bellefontaine does not need to be a guinea pig for marijuana distribution. It's going to be available some places in Ohio, certainly. Let's wait and see what works out in these other towns. But we certainly don't need to be a guinea pig about it. We don't need to be the revenue. It doesn't need to be a revenue producer. The city has plenty of money, so we're certainly not looking to get revenue out of it. Look at your general fund. We have an income tax increase that got put into effect. So we certainly don't need revenue from that type of activity. Above all, peddling marijuana sends the wrong message to our youth. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's good for our community. Certainly, we ought to be able to recognize there's one thing our community doesn't need, and that's more drugs. There's a lot of positive things going on in our community, but sales of marijuana would be a negative. So when you get the time to study that ordinance, I certainly recommend its passage. I also heard in somebody's report that the idea of having golf carts was brought up. And some members of the administration or council, I'm not sure anybody was around back then, but Bonnie was. Thank you, Bonnie. Probably 15 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that. There was a push for that. A gentleman who lived on the south side of 540 wanted to use his golf cart to go visit the cemetery. And certainly people had some sympathy for his desire to do that. But after the study by the police, by the administration, the safety committee, and certainly at my urging, the specter of having people running around Bellefontaine trying to cross state routes on golf carts, our city certainly hasn't got any less busy from 15 years ago. And I would certainly urge council not to approve having golf carts on the city streets. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Trawl.
Good evening, everyone. I am Sue Neer. I live at 3743 Logan Road, Bellefontaine, Ohio. I don't live within the Bellefontaine city limits, but I am a taxpayer and a property owner in this community. And I have seen time and time again, when there have been opportunities for this community to have a steady flow of money coming in, and it gets voted down every time. You continuously put the burden on the taxpayers, and that's very unfair when we have had multiple chances to change that. Cannabis is legal in Ohio because the majority of the voters said it should be. I grew up in the 70s and I've smoked my fair share of marijuana, as most everyone I knew in high school did as well. But I have not used any cannabis in any form for decades. I still know quite a few who do, and I certainly do not believe in any way that it is a gateway drug at all, nor is there substantial evidence to prove it is. I did research on that today. Elton John's opinion isn't really substantial evidence. People have used marijuana for decades and will continue to do so regardless of what the laws are. So why shouldn't we be making money from that instead of just saying, oh no, thanks, but we don't need any money. Our citizens will just continue to foot the bill for us. That's unacceptable to those of us on a fixed income when we see our taxes just continue to climb and our representatives refuse to change anything that would help us on that. Have we even had a request to open a dispensary? I understand being proactive, but not when it keeps substantial money off the books. States are receiving millions of dollars in taxes from the sale of recreational marijuana. I sincerely ask you to not prohibit this and future projects that will bring revenue into our county. Thank you.
Are there any other members of the audience who seek to address council on any issue?
Good evening. My name is Will Heinig. I live at 2180 Township Road 56, Bellefontaine. I was here this evening hoping to hear the discussion on the solar, but since that's been tabled, I'll be back next time. But the concerns or questions I had on that, I know was previously brought up kind of in conjunction with the annexation request by Duff's. And there was some concern that maybe there wasn't any bond requirements or needing additional setbacks. So I'd like just to clearly understand what has since maybe changed in the zoning and planning for solar, and if that's able to be articulated to the public. And I would also like to understand why it was dropped last time and why it's being brought up now at this time, also separate from the annexation. So that's all I have for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Honey. Any other members of the audience seek to address council on any issue? Seeing no one else approach the lectern, that will conclude the communications from citizens portion of our meeting. We'll now move to ordinances and resolutions for first reading.
Ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the Bellefontaine Municipal Court Prosecutor, Secretary, Paralegal, and Victim Witness Coordinator, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Springs,
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule?
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ailer?
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Motion to pass on first and final?
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ailer?
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Motion to adopt?
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ailer?
Yes.
An ordinance approving approving and adopting new planning and zoning regulations regarding solar energy systems for the city of Belle Fountain to be codified as chapter 1166 of the codified ordinances of said city.
Chair recognizes Mrs. James for purposes of making a motion.
Motion to table this from this agenda until we have full council available for a vote.
Do I have a second? Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
An ordinance by the Belle Fountain City Council exercising the city's right under Ohio Revised Code Section 3780.25 to prohibit the sale of recreational marijuana within the municipal corporation by enacting Chapter 731 of the codified ordinances of the city of Belle Fountain to prohibit all adult use cannabis operators within the municipal corporation and declaring an emergency.
Chair recognizes Mrs. James for purposes of making a motion.
Motion to table this ordinance as well until full council is here and available to vote.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the city engineer or service safety director to enter into contract with Logan County Engineers Office and/or Howard Harrison Township for a chip seal overlay of the city portion of Township Road 46 North near State Route 47 toward County Road 13 and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Ayler.
Motion for first reading only.
Motion to pass on first reading only. Do I have a second? Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances and resolutions for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the service safety director to accept on behalf of the city of Belle Fountain certain real estate from the Board of County Commissioners in the vicinity of Cooper Avenue and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Ayler.
Motion to adopt.
This would be a motion to pass on second reading only.
Second reading.
Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. There are no ordinances for third reading. Are there any communications from the clerk?
Just to remind you all, there's a hearing next council meeting at 7 o'clock. And that's it for me.
Is that the next council meeting or is that, I thought that was the 25th.
Oh, February, the second one in February.
Okay.
Yes, you're right. I'm
All right.
sorry. Correct.
And that hearing will be at 7 o'clock PM. Are any communications from members of council? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn. Motion made by Mr. Ayler, second by Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
That was the
Yeah.
There's a. You sound like today. Sure. Pass that down. Fred too. Mr. Shelley.
I think this is I think it's already. Fred.
I asked John, she goes, that no one ever realized.
Is that, what's the
I know,
public hearing?
What's that?
What's the public hearing?
It's who's a second? It's a meeting to consider rezoning request submitted by Carrie Wheatland of ACW